I do want to talk about the other piece you recently wrote for us a little while back that is in the same vein, in the same category as this one, but deals more specifically with California. So in the wake of the mass shootings that happened there in January, you saw Governor Newsom touting California's gun death rate as evidence that, again, the strict gun control policies he supports work. Can you tell us a little bit more about California in particular on this topic?
Oh, I have a lot to say about my home state, but we'll keep it focused here. So Governor Newsom, my friend Governor Newsom, he did indeed come out and say after the series of mass shootings, at least the first one, I don't know if the second one had happened yet at that point, but he came out and used this same sort of tactic, the gun death rate, and used that to proclaim that California has a lower overall gun death rate. Of course, California has a very low suicide rate comparatively, but a pretty average. I think it's on the better side of things, so it isn't bad, but the homicide rate is nothing extraordinary. And I think the piece that I had done, it's been a minute since I looked at it, but it compared its next door neighbors, because I always think that's the best comparison as opposed to going across the country, because there's more of a closer relationship with neighboring states. And Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon, and all those states have less gun control than California. I know Oregon recently passed its magazine capacity limits and licensing, but that hasn't really even taken effect yet. So Oregon, while it's not Arizona, but it was less. It did have a lot less gun control than California did. Oregon has half the homicide rate. Nevada has almost the same homicide rate. I want to say it was 4.4 versus 4.7, and Arizona is only slightly higher at 5.1 per 100,000 versus California's 4.4. And these are all states to varying degree, especially Arizona, which have significantly less gun control, and they're right next door. But they do have higher suicide rates. All of them, I believe. I can't recall Oregon. So that's where that's what Governor Newsom latches onto to make his point.
Yeah, in your piece on this, which is a member exclusive, by the way, the new one is free for everyone. This one is a member exclusive. You talk about how every town's gun law strength rating for California is 86.5, which is among the highest, if not the highest.
Yeah, it is the highest.
Arizona is an 8.5, yet the difference in their murder rate, their gun murder rate, is negligible. It's 4.4 to 5.1.
And that was just that year. I think it was a couple times in the 2010s. Yeah. I think 2015, Arizona had a lower rate, and that was after 5 years of their constitutional carry being enacted. So California is usually a little bit lower than Arizona, but it does fluctuate, and the states tend to be very close together year after year, despite being polar opposites on the degree of gun rights that they honor.
Yeah, and there's lots of other states as well. I think you're right as far as comparing neighbors goes, especially when you have two neighboring states that are so starkly aligned in this issue. There's such stark divisions between Arizona, which, like you mentioned, is a permitless carry state. It has no assault weapons ban. It's one of the states that has the least restrictive gun laws in the country. And then California, of course, is right next door with what I think many would argue are the most restrictive gun laws.
Yeah, and I also like Arizona because it counters a claim I hear. So usually when you make these sorts of claims, a lot of the states with the low homicides rates are states like New Hampshire, Vermont, Wyoming, Idaho. And the usual counter argument to that is, well, these are rural states. Arizona isn't California, but it's not exactly a rural state. It certainly has rural parts, but Phoenix is a very big city. It has other big cities there in that state. So it makes for a good comparison for that reason as well. It's not just another, rural backwater, as they call it, quote unquote. So it is a populous metropolitan state in many areas. And despite that, and despite its permissive attitude towards guns, the homicide rate is very close to California's.
Yeah, and you listed out a number of other states that have a similar lower homicide rate, gun-related homicide rate in particular as well, than California. And so you've got here Maine, North Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, Montana, Alaska, Colorado, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Kansas, and Florida. So it's California's rate is just not that exceptional. I
Yeah,
think is
it's
the big
fine. I
takeaway.
think I'd call it fine. Like it's decent, but it's not exceptional. That's accurate. All those states you listed either have lower rates than California or only slightly higher rates than California.
Right. And actually, the RAND Corporation, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of gun related research, that's a little more down the line than a lot of the other ones out there. Like, oftentimes, like John Hopkins, for instance, is funded by Bloomberg directly, their gun violence research program. And so RAND Corporation is a little bit more independent than some of the other groups out there, though they're not necessarily terribly ideologically focused one way or the other. They put out a new resource, I guess you'd call it, on their website that lets you look at all of the individual states on the basis of their gun death rate, their homicide rate, their suicide rate, their gun homicide rate, and their gun suicide rate. And honestly, while there's a lot more to that I'm very skeptical of inside of this new program that RAND is doing, including, they sort of they give you this tool that lets you try and adjust individual states' gun laws, and then they give you like a percentage effect that would have on the murder or suicide rates, which I find highly, highly questionable that you could actually reliably do something like that based off of the evidence that exists, especially since a lot of these states, sometimes a state adopting the strictest gun laws will bring its murder rate down. Sometimes it'll make it go up. And it's like, okay, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that the base tool of letting you see each state by gun murder rate and then just overall murder rate can be fairly useful. And what I see looking at it are frankly more regional differences than ideological differences. For instance, the South tends to be more violent. Most southern states have more overall homicides and gun related homicides than most Northeastern or Mountain West states do. And then they also tend to have fewer suicides than the Northeast or Mountain West.
Yeah, I
states.
believe the usual suicide majority, homicide minority actually flips in the South. I think it's actually more homicides in the South and less suicides. And I don't know what causes that, but
right.
I mean, you can say, for example, like a state like Mississippi is very similar to a state like Idaho in terms of gun laws, but they're polar opposites on the results, right? That Idaho is a very, very safe state and Mississippi is not. So
yeah. And so there seems to be a lot more going on here than
absolutely.
just what gun laws you have in place and, how many guns per capita you have in the state, which is another thing that's even harder to measure. And then, of course, I think there's another inherent flaw in sort of even that basic approach of looking at these things from a state level, right? Because I believe you wrote a piece for us a while back that talked about this, but crime, especially murder, is not really a state level issue in the United States. It's more of a local issue, a city level issue. Same for suicide too, actually, and there's sort of the inverse problems, right? Suicide rates tend to be higher in rural areas and lower in urban areas, and murder rates tend to be higher in urban areas and lower in rural areas. Is that right?
No, that's entirely correct. I think one of the states I had looked at was Missouri, where your homicide rate in Missouri depends entirely on whether you're in Kansas City or St. Louis. Because if you're not, it's very close to the national average. If you are, it's like sadly a third world country in terms of homicide rate. So